This is session 16 of the class on Introduction to the Old Testament. Today we are looking at the poetic interpretation. First of all, we are going to look at the introduction. Introduction is based on an article that Dr. Sid Basil from the Daily Bread University wrote some years ago, and it's now part of the Old Testament course at that university. In this lesson we will study the Bible's most profound and treasured literature. In fact, it's some of the most beautiful literature written anywhere. In this lesson we will study Israel's Old Testament poetry. There are 5 Old Testament books which we called poetry. That is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs and Lamentations. And not all of them completely fit the idea of poetry, but we will look at it. Many narrative books, prose books, will have parts of literature in a sense that it is poetry. So it's a mixture in many cases. For example, Isaiah is one of them. It goes from in English Bible language spoken, it goes from Genesis to Malachi. Remember, the order in the Old Testament of the Jewish nation, the Jewish religion, the order is different. But let's now cover this with the Bibles we are using today. First, we are going to look at what we call the characteristics of the Old Testament poetry. Poetry in English has a certain rhythm, a certain rhyme. In Hebrew poetry, it's different. The Near East anyway, the languages spoken there, they have a different way of looking at the rhythm in the language. So it's hard to compare. So we cannot go with the idea that everything will rhyme, because it will not. That's not the way Hebrew poetry is written. It has to do with the poem's construction rather than with rhyme or meter. In some cases, and that's what we already said, that is that certain poetic verses are included in prose text. So that is also something we have to look for. So if you try to read the Old Testament, and then specifically the poetic parts, and you will read it quickly, casually, easily, you will fail to understand, because it's absolutely something you can't do. So you have to do it according to the way the people there and then looked at the text, listened at the text, read the text in a certain way. So please, one of the specific things, and we will touch on it now and we will come back to it later, that is what we call parallelism. There are several types of parallelism. Generally, you have the different ways of presenting lines one after the other. For example, you can have a line which says something, and then the second line parallel to it will say the same thing with other words. Or you can have a line saying something, and then the second line will go against it. And then you have a possibility of having a line that is saying something, and the second line is actually adding to it. So those are three different things. For example, in Psalm 118, verse 1, let's look at it. Psalm 118, 118, that is right before the longest psalm in our Bibles. And of course, when you there, then you have a problem finding 118, verse 1. You have to go completely to the beginning of the text, and then you see Psalm 117, the short psalm, and then in verse 1 of Psalm 118, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his love endures forever. That is something that is being you can say that's a repetition in the book of Psalms itself. So it's not always not only used here, but it's being repeated in the book of Psalms. So that can be one author writing and rewriting, or that can be imitating another writer, because we know that there are several writers in the book of Psalms. David is one of them, Asaph is another one, but there are a whole range, and even time-wise, we know that the book of Psalms is not written in one specific time, although it looks like being linked to the kingdom idea. It's behind there, but okay, let's go for it. So we have several types of parallelism we talked about. We see that certain things are being said in a different way as what we would do. When we speak about the poetic books, as you remember, there are no specific in the Old Testament of the Bible of the Jewish people. They don't have poetic books as such. They only have prophetic books and writings. So historical books, or the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then you have prophetic books, and then you have writings. No such a thing as poetic book, but for us, we use that term because that's being used for at least 1500 years now. The problem there is that some of the books, for example, Proverbs and Job, are not exactly the same thing as, for example, the book of Psalms. It's not even written in the same way. It's not even set in the same way. The setting is not the same. So what we have is those books are more or less what we call wisdom literature, much more than poetic books. But yeah, well, wisdom is another type of literature we claim to have, but the Jews say no. Well, wisdom, yes, but not as a separate type of Old Testament books. One of the most important books, of course, is the book of Psalms. Actually, the book of Psalms is not one book, but 5 books. And so it is very strange to see many people do not know this. And then they dig in and they say, what is this? The numbers are going on. I mean, the psalm we just read, Psalm 118, is part of the last book, the 5th book of Psalms. And 150 Psalms, you could say, okay, that means more or less like every 30 Psalms you have another book. That's not how it works. But you have to go to Psalm 1, and then you find then you find at least the explanation, the beginning of the book. Okay, so Psalm 1, and then you find Psalm 1, Book 1 is Psalm 1 to 41. And then you go to 41 to see what the second part is. And the second part is, of course, starting by Psalm 42nd or 42 to 72. And then you go to 72, because then you have the third book, which is Psalm 73 to 89. And then in the fourth book of Psalms, of course, starts with Psalm 90, and then that's the complete book. So you have you have Psalm 90 to Psalm 106. That's the fourth book, and the last book is from 107 to 150. So this is just to give you an idea that what we do with the books, it's not always, the Jews don't find it really amusing. Let me say it politely. Okay, so they don't. Psalm 90, for example. Let's look at it. A prayer of Moses. So we may assume that Moses is the writer, but it says that it's a prayer of Moses, the man of God. So maybe it's someone else writing about Moses, or writing on a script that's given by Moses. So I'm not excluding anything here. What I'm saying is, when you look at Psalms, they are hymns. They're actually sang, so you can sing them. Well, it's a bit difficult for us to sing those psalms in the way we have them. So that's what the Reformed churches were doing, was actually put them on music. That's how they call it. So they sing. You can sing all the psalms. So 150 psalms, you can sing them all, because all of them are, well, let's say songs, but not in the same way as what we use songs. They are also prayers, and that is important because it speaks about the prayer of Moses. So it's a prayer that's being sung. And of course you have not only prayer but also praise. So you have a lot of praise in the Psalms, but you also have worship in the Psalms. You have thanks for deliverance, you have confidence, you have power, you have willingness to deliver. But on the other hand, you have Psalms that are really, you can almost say, confessions of the wrongdoings of people, or confessions of the wrong ideas of people, confessing to the Lord, oh my God, I had wrong ideas about you, about something else, about someone else. So in some cases it's frustration, in some cases it's just a way of saying things. But you have to understand, these texts are inspired by God himself. The Lord God inspired by his Holy Spirit what the people had to say. And so there are thousands of psalms written, and just 150 of them are in the book of Psalms, or in the books of Psalms, and those are the ones God is using. And it's almost like God is saying, you can say whatever is on your heart, whatever is on your mind. In some cases, some people say, whatever is on your liver. It means just say it, bring it out. And that is what's happening in the book of Psalms. So that's a great thing we see here. God understands whatever our problems, whatever our limitations, whatever our difficulties in life are. You can almost say that he says, let's deal with it. Come up, tell me. Okay, and then we have Songs of Solomon. Psalms, different writers, Songs of Solomon. Well, the text itself says that it is Solomon is writing. It's a difficult book for readers to read if you just want to read through it. It's a story about a young man and a young woman. They fell in love, and it's a natural attraction to each other, but it's lifted up to a spiritual level. This is one book Muslims have a big problem with, because they consider this as pornography. It's not pornography. It is the love expressed. And if we cannot express our love, a man cannot express his love to his wife, then what are we doing? Because this is integral part of who we are, what we are. We are human beings, and sexuality is part of who we are. Of course, sexuality in the first place is the reason for sexuality is procreation, but there's more to it. It is liking each other, loving each other, caring for each other. It is bringing together two people, not because only of love, but of love in a deep sense of the word. Not only a physical love, but also a spiritual and a mental love. So it has to do with the marital or the marriage relationship. And only when you're married, you understand this. When you're married for a long time, you understand it better. Of course, people who are not married will never really grasp the idea. Then you have the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is a strange book in the sense that it is written by a prophet, and it sounds prophetic, but it's not prophetic. But it's like I said, it sounds prophetic because it's the one who is writing it is a prophet, and he opens up to God, and his heart is broken because of the ruins of Jerusalem. Is in a certain sense saying, God, why have you forsaken us? But God has not forsaken them. They have forsaken God. And that's the difference. So what we have is, we have in those books, we have a deep meditative wording and ideas and forms and phrases and those things. You know, you have to understand that one third of the whole of the Old Testament is actually this type of material we are talking about. So it is important for us to understand. Let God speak to the depth of your heart. Let God speak to the depth of your soul. You have to think, you have to pray, you have to meditate when you read this part of the Old Testament, the poetry part. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We already talked about it, but you're going to be again very fast. Like I said, 1/3 of the text of the Old Testament is poetry. Totally different poetry from what we have in English, and also what you probably have in your own language. I'm coming from Europe, and we have a more Greek Latin way of poetry, which means that we are more or less like the English, but in this case, just think about it. This is different. We are talking about, you can almost say, you will never, as a foreigner, as an alien to the Hebrew culture, you will never be able to really grasp the fine tuning that is being done in the wording, in the way things are said, in the way words are used, in the vowels, in the consonants. It's beautiful, but it's extremely difficult. So I'm not asking you to understand. I'm just saying there is a different way of looking at it. We have a proof of the ancient time poetry. We found that in Ugarit, that is in Ras Shamra, that's in the 15th century BC. That is around the time when the people of Israel came back from Egypt and landed eventually in Canaan. So around that time. And so when you see things similar here in the text as what we find in Ugarit, I think it proves that both are written in the same time. Another characteristic which we have not touched on, that is the fact that a lot is very compact. It's closed. It's in few words, many things are said, and it uses a lot of imagery. So it's images, and of course, like I said, some of the images are completely lost to us. You have to understand it is written. So the advantage, if it was spoken, would be that they could put emphasis on words or on a part of the sentence. But since it is written, you can't do that. So what I'm saying is it is primary, not oral. Primary, not oral. It's highly structured. In that sense, it's similar to what we have, the rhyming system, the meter system, and the structure is expressed in levels. We talked about parallelism, but I also talked about word plays, and that is, we have to take that in, that certain things we don't even see when we read the text anymore. We have a structure. There's a lot of structure in the poetic books. It makes it even more difficult, but let me give it to you so you will know. And I'm not saying you will be able to understand everything. That's not what I want to reach with you. That's not what I want to bring to you. But I want you to know that the structure is all over. There are books written, and it started in the 18th century up till now. Books and books are written about it. For example, there is the idea by Bishop Robert Love. He speaks about the synonymous. The lines express the same thoughts in different words. When you go to Psalm 3, Psalm 3 verse 1. Psalm 3 verse 1. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? So that's a clear parallelism. Same thing as is said by different words. It goes on, you know. You can take many more examples. 14:9 verse 1 again. Hear this, all your people, listen, all who live in this world. So the same idea is being posed once, and secondly, the same thing is being said but different wording. There's a whole range of things. Proverbs 20 verse 1, Isaiah 1 verse 3, Amos 5 verse 24. Like I said, the whole range. And then you have antithetic. It means the lines express the opposite thoughts. That means there's a contrast between. You can find that again in the first Psalm, Psalm 1 verse 6. 1 verse 6. So the first Psalm 1:6. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. So the but is important. Whenever you see this but, you know there is a antithesis, something else being said against the first line. You find it in a whole range of text. Psalm 90 verse 6, Proverbs 1 verse 6 and verse 29, chapter 10 verse 1 and 12, chapter 15 verse 1, chapter 19 verse 4. And then you have synthetic. One thing is said and one thing is added. Again, you go to Psalm 1 and you see the situation there. When you read verses 1 and 2. Blessed is the one who does not walk in the steps of the wicked, or stands in the way of the sinners, take or sit in the company of mockers. So you have the adding things. Dr. Briggs, in his general introduction to the study of the Holy Scripture in the 19th century already, said there is a whole range. There's emblematic. It's one clause is literal, and the other part is metaphorical. He gives Psalm 42 verse 1 for 103 verse 3, and then you have climatic. It means it's like a stair. It's in ascending fashion. Psalm 19 verse 7 to 14 is an example. 29 verse 1 and 2. 103 verse 20 and 22, 222, I'm sorry. And then you have introvert or chaistic. That is a series of clauses, usually at least 4 are related to an internal structure of the lines. So line number 1 can say something, and line number 4 is saying something, and then 2 and 3 are saying the opposite. Or 1 is the opposite of 2, and 2 is the opposite of 4, but 1 and 4 are similar. It's just the way of looking at it, and it goes on, you know. Gray is saying in his book, The Forms of Hebrew Poetry, you have the balanced and you have the imbalanced. And again, Psalm 83 verse 14, Psalm 59 verse 16, and Psalm 75 verse 6. Another one is saying there's a sound pattern. So there's a play with the alphabet. It's, for example, it's acrostic. For one big Psalm 119 is acrostic. So it starts, the different parts starts with the first letter of the alphabet. It starts with a letter following the alphabetical order in the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, it's a play of consonant. That's alliteration. It's a play with vowels, a play with repetition of words. There's a play with similar sounds. There's an opening and a close. So this is again, we call that inclusive. There are several types of poetry in the Old Testament. Some are topic related, some are form related. And yeah, so topic related, that's understand. Form related means it has the same form and being used and reused again. So you have dictation. For example, in Numbers 21 verse 17 and 18. But you also have a work song. It is alluded in Judges 9 verse 27. You have ballads. So you also have what you call drinking songs. You have the negative, you have the positive. The negative you have, that is Isaiah 5, 11 to 13. The positive, Isaiah 22 verse 13. You have love poems, Song of Songs, wedding riddles, wedding songs. But you also have laments and dirges. Dirges are things being said when someone died or some bad thing happened. Sometimes it's only alluded, sometimes it's really outspoken. And then, of course, you have what we call war songs. I remember watching a movie about the German underseas, the U-boats. And one of the U-boats was underwater, and on top of it you had an English frigate, and they were just waiting until the boat would come up, and the Germans refused to come up with their boat. But you could hear them singing. All of them were singing the same hymn at the same time, and that even vibrated not only the boat itself, but also the water on top of it. So there was so strong water, and you can find those war songs here in the Bible also. Special benedictions. Let me use a strange word, magical text. But you have sacred poems, you have acrostic poems, you have curses. For example, in Numbers 21 verse 22 to 30, you have count poems. So, like what I'm saying, you have a whole range. You have a whole range. Now let's look at some guidelines when we try to interpret the text. The first thing you have to do is look for the central theme, the central truth, sometimes the central stanza or strophe. The strophe is like a paragraph in prose. So it's things together, different lines, or even sometimes different sentences together, saying something not only similar but about the same thing, and that's a strophe. Luckily, in our modern translations, people understood that when they translated the poetic books, that you need to take the form of the Hebrew instead of the form of the English wording and the English outlook and summaries. So what they did was they tried to go as close as possible to the Hebrew language and trying to explain it, but not explaining it as such, but putting it, you can say, they influenced the layout of the text so we can understand it better. So that's the first thing you have to do. Secondly, you have to identify whether you're talking about or whether figurative language is used. Sometimes the figurative language is part of the prose text it's in. Remember those types. Remember that they are very compact. So it's not about line. No, sometimes it's just 2 lines in a prose text, and that's what we have to look for. And in some cases, we make the mistake by just thinking that it's prose text, and so we can use that as. No, we can't. Be sure to relate to the longer issue-oriented poems. Like I said, sometimes it's compact in one or two sentences. Sometimes it's a whole range, like the book of Psalms. So be careful. We are not talking about everything is in the same way, because it's all different. There are all different types of things being done and being said in this Old Testament. For example, the book of Judges, the chapters 4 and 5. 4 is prose, 5 is poetry. You have to know, you have to understand. If you don't, then you make a mistake. Attempt to find the parallelism, because parallelism in poetic text is most of the time there anyway. Whether it's used synonymously, antithetic, synthetic. Like I said, this is again very important. Okay, let's go to the next. We are looking at one more book, and that will be it. That is the book of Job. We all know 42 chapters long, about the rich man becoming poor and the poor man becoming rich. And that is a beautiful story, but it's much more than that. The name itself, what is the word Job means? Well, there are, and that's again, it already starts with a problem, because some people interpret it as where is father, and then it's actually not Job or Job. Somebody said, no, it's the word enemy. Well, yeah, that's a possibility. But then the other one said, no, it's not that, it's who repents. Maybe. Let's look at some people who had something to say about the book itself. This is a powerful, artistic, and meaningful book. Luther, the great reformer, said it is magnificent and sublime as no other book of Scripture. Tennyson, a commentator, said it is the greatest poem, whether ancient or modern. Carlyle said there's nothing written in the Bible or out of it of equal merit. So it's, you can almost say this is a book separated from the rest of the world. This is the measure, this is the standard. So that's about the book. Canonization. Why do we speak about canonization? Because why is the book of Job in the Bible? Why is the book of Job in the Old Testament? Why has the Jews accepted it? Let me tell you a story about how prophets were accepted. When a prophet, according to the Torah, recorded certain things he had said, or someone else recorded it about him, then of course you have a possibility that this is the word of God. Today we have the full of it, but in the time of the Jewish nation, especially the kings, there was no such a thing as the full Old Testament or the full Old Bible. No, of course not. They were still in the process of working on it. And how it functioned was the following. When someone came with a book to Jerusalem, he brought it to the high priest. And then the high priest read it, and when he said yes, he took the book and brought it into the temple as being part of the sacred books of the Old Testament, of the Jewish nation, of the Jewish religion. But the book of Job was never accepted in that way. The reason is very simple. It was written before there was a temple. So, how do you do? How do you go? Well, it became part of it, became part of the canon of the Old Testament because of its intrinsic value. The way he looked, the way the people could relate, the way the things were said, how the friends of Job were going against Job with rules and regulations that are similar to the law, but are not in the law. And Job knew that. So there was a difficulty. But at the same time, we assume that Job was living in the same time bracket as Abraham. And then, of course, you understand what the difficulty is by accepting it as such. So it's the same historical period, and it's different from what else we have in the Old Testament, because the books of Moses, of course, they were accepted because Moses wrote them, and that was, you can almost say, that was enough for them to accept it. And so the book of Job is probably even older than the books of Moses. Okay, we looked at the fact that we are talking about the poetic books and the relationship with the wisdom literature. Job is one of those wisdom books. It's wisdom from the beginning to the end. Well, you have a prose part, then you have a poetic part, and then you have a prose part again. So try to understand, try to follow. So you have an historical narrative. That can be the genre we are talking about. It can be a dramatic presentation of a philosophical, theological theme. Or maybe it's a parable. 3 possibilities. But Job was literally, listen to this, Job was in a literary way similar to existing literature, but not theological. So you can almost say it sounded the same, but it has a deeper meaning. It has the meaning of the one true God against philosophical wisdom. Let's look at some examples. There is a book called the Sumerian Job, written around 2000 BC. It speaks about a person that complains. It speaks about undeserved suffering. It speaks about abandoned by a deity. It speaks about a request of a court hearing. It speaks about sin revealed. And already you know that is not the Job we are talking about. But it looks like it. Another one, the Babylonian writing called I Will Praise the Lord of Wisdom. It's sometimes called the Babylonian Job. Like the Sumerian Job, you have the Babylonian Job. First, you have the first person monologue, and then deserted by the gods, forsaken by his friends, finally restoration, health and wealth. This looks a lot like Job. So people say, oh, that's how where Job finds his roots. Maybe it's just the opposite. If Job is written first, then this one are actually borrowing from Job. Then you have the dialogue about human misery, again a Babylonian text. dating from 1000 BC. That's around the time of David and Saul, David, Solomon, around that time. There's an acrostic dialogue about suffering. It's suffering and friends, similarity. The problem about human failure is there also at some point, and then you see there is a, and there are other books or other material like the Egyptian protest of an eloquent peasant, an Egyptian writing again a dispute with his soul to the one is tired of life. So it's more or less like a suicide note, but that's not what we find. What does the book contain? The book contains a monologue. It contains dialogue with friends, and contains dialogue with Yahweh. It opens and closes with prose, so the middle part is different. So what is the genre? Well, it's a mixture. So who wrote the book of Job? Since it has no name written on it, and since it is not being part of the 5 books of Moses, Moses can be still the author, but we don't know. That's a maybe. Because some manuscripts put Job right behind the Torah. So there you have the link. So someone said, well, it's not Moses, it's a Jewish philosopher. Yeah, well, maybe. Well, you can actually look at Moses as the philosopher, so that's also a possibility. Some scholars said no, it's a book that came into existence over a time period, similar as the Gospels, but also similar as, for example, the Quran of the Islamic people came over time and it was edited. Maybe, yeah, there's a possibility there. But let's now look at the person himself, Job the man. Seemingly, he's an historical figure. He's mentioned in Ezekiel 14 verse 14 and 20, James 5 verse 1. His name is being used outside in the Tel El Amarna texts. But we are talking about same name, different person. Another thing that's being mentioned in the book of Job, that is the finances, the money, the kesita. That's the currency. Similar currency you find in Genesis 33 and in Joshua 24. So it gives us an idea who this man was. Job is apparently not Jewish. He's not using the Yahweh name, but he's using the Elohim word. That is a more generalized word, God. Sometimes he calls him El, but he also calls him Shaddai. So El Shaddai, you know, that's God the Almighty. Well, he may be a wise man from different parts, because the Bible also gives us some ideas, but we don't know. Okay, that's the date. When was it written? Most probably in the 2nd millennium BC. Job acts as a priest. He has a long life. They are semi-nomadic. There are bands of Sabaeans and Chaldean raiders, and Job lived for a time in the city. So that gives us a date, an idea. The genre of the book, and during the period of the production of wisdom literature, this would be in line with King David to Hezekiah. But that's an unclear statement here. Historical setting, we are talking about the land of Edom, Aram, Uz, one of them. Then you have the literal units. In general, it is Job's friends, chapters 3 to 37, Elihu's respond, 32 to 37, and then God responds, and then we have the prose epilogue. The main truths that are being mentioned is the covenantal theology, that the righteous are blessed in this life and the wicked are punished in this life. Elihu, who publicly refuted and corrected both Job and his three friends, is an example of it. The book asserts that God is just. We live in an unfair, in a fallen world. We are speaking about adversaries, we're speaking about human people, but also we're speaking about angelic people. And then you have themes or terms and phrases and people. Blameless 1 verse 1, 2 verse 3, sons of God 1 verse 6, 2 verse 1, Potchurf 2 verse 8, Sheol 7 verse 9, Papyrus 8 verse 11, Rahab 9 verse 13, 26 verse 12 and 13, Abaddon 26 verse 6, Ransom 33 verse 24, the Leviathan 3 verse 8, Behemoth 40 verse 15. A number of people are being mentioned: the man of the east, Satan, Sabaeans, Chaldeans, the Almighty Shaddai, and Elihu. So we know that it can say very specific, although it starts with prose, poetry, and ends with prose.